with me, your man, Louie T. Welcome to the command post. You know what it is. Post up. Take command. I, of course, am your commander-in-chief, Louie T. Thank you for joining me. So, we heard from special teams coach Larry Izzo, a.k.a. L to the Izzo, and he really emphasized just how big of a deal this new kickoff rule is for the league and for the special teams unit. And I don't know if I actually viewed it in the light and kind of gave it its proper due. I don't think the magnitude of the new changes to the special teams rules really hit me. I'm like, yeah, okay, the special teams rules have changed. It's going to change fundamentally how teams return the football. And I didn't really think about the strategy that is involved and just how significant it really truly is until listening to Larry Izzo talk about it yesterday. So we're going to talk about what he had to say. I think he said some things that kind of changed the way that I view special teams and the kickoff in particular this year, and all of the different decisions that they have to weigh. And he's like, I've been obsessing over it. So we'll talk about that. But here's something that we haven't done. And this show is going to be all centered around special teams, because we talked about this on Wednesday night, and we've kind of hinted at this throughout the course of the offseason about how important special teams is. But obviously with the recent situation with Brandon McManus happening, we've talked more about special teams in the last 2 weeks or so than we have pretty much all offseason combined. So I think now this is a great time to have this discussion, because I've had this discussion on my podcast in great detail, especially when this first came out and the rule was officially changed. I don't think we've actually talked about it here on the command post, though, as it pertains to the Commanders. So what I want to do is get in depth with you on the new kickoff rules so that you're aware of what it's going to look like, okay? I don't think we've done that here. I know we've done it on the podcast, but not all of you are consumers of the podcast. So let's take a look at what the new special teams rules are before we talk about what Larry Izzo had to say, because he's referencing a lot of these things, and if you don't know what he's talking about, you may be a little confused. So for those of you who are in the know, that you are well aware of what this all looks like, I apologize in advance. Just bear with me. But for those of you who don't, and this is your first real exposure to this, pay attention, because I don't want you to have sort of a shock when we get to, the preseason and you start seeing this new setup and you're like, wait a minute, what the hell's going on? I'll explain now. So let's take a look at the new kickoff rule. So obviously the NFL adopted this from the XFL. So the XFL recently did this to try to combat concussions. And one of the ways they felt like concussions were really happening on these kickoffs was because of the rate of speed that the players were running at, which then increase the amount of force upon contact. So to reduce the amount of speed, you can't get up to 21 miles an hour, running if there's only, and hit someone if there's only 5 yards worth of space between the two parties, right? So they've, busted up those wedges, and now here's the next step is to reduce the space. And the NFL is going to adopt it. They don't know how this is going to go. And Izzo talked about that, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. But let's first talk about the concept and what it looks like. So the kickoff is still going to take place from the 35-yard line. So you see the football. If you're looking at the model on the left where you see the football, it's on the 35, because that's where the kickoff is going to start from, like it always has, okay? So the kicker is the only player that is back on the 35-yard line where the ball is going to be kicked off from. The other 10 participants on the kickoff coverage unit are all going to be lined up at the 40-yard line, okay? So the other 10 guys are going to be lined up at the opposing team's 40-yard line, okay? So on the opposite side of midfield, going towards the end zone where the ball is being kicked, They'll be lined up at that 40-yard line, as you can see on the diagram. The return unit is going to have at least 9 guys in this setup zone, if you will, right? So the red dots that you see are the return blockers, right? This is called the setup zone. That is between the 30 and the 35-yard line, okay? So 7 of the 9 players have to be on the 35-yard line. Their feet have to be on the 35, okay? So the kickoff start line is those X's. All 10 of those players have to have their feet on the 40-yard line. The setup zone is for the return blockers, and 7 of the 9 guys have to be on the 35-yard line. Now, the other 2 players, you can have them somewhere in between the 30 and the 35. So they could be at the 34, it could be at the 33, the 32, the 31, or they could even be at the 30. They can't be any further back than the 30, but they have to be somewhere in that neighborhood. Okay, but the other 7 guys have to have their feet on the 35. 2 other players in that setup zone can be in between the 30 and 35, right? So that's essentially how it's going to look. It's going to look a little weird initially if you haven't watched, the XFL, which I haven't. So this is all going to be sort of new for me viewing it. But you're allowed to have 2 return men, okay? They have to be in what is called the landing zone, and Coach Izzo talked about that, and we'll get into greater detail as to what the landing zone means here in a bit. But the landing zone is from the goal line to the 20-yard line, okay? So you can have 2 return men standing anywhere they want to stand between the goal line and the 20-yard line, right? They have to be somewhere in that mix. Now, this is all what the kickoff rule is going to look like. Now, I'm going to explain to you what the landing zone is here in a second and the significance of it. But this is the setup, so just conceptualize this in your mind and kind of just think about what it all looks like now, right? The only people that can move with the ball in the air are the kicker and the 2 return men. No one else can move until the ball has hit the ground or it's been possessed. Okay? So one of those 2 things has to take place in order for anyone that is trying to make a tackle or blocking can move. All right? So again, conceptualize that in your mind. No motion can take place from any players on the field other than the kicker and the 2 return men until either one of 2 things has transpired. The ball has been touched or it's hit the ground. All right. The ball has to hit the ground inside the landing zone first, or it's a penalty. Okay, so if the ball hits the ground first at the 21-yard line, it's a penalty. It has to land inside the 20 all the way back to the back of the end zone. It has to land somewhere. It needs to land in the landing zone in order to force a return. So if the ball lands anywhere between the goal line and the 20-yard line, which is where your 2 return men are going to be set up, it has to be returned. There's no fair catches like college football. You can't take a knee. If it hits the ground and it trickles into the end zone, you got to go and get it. Okay? You got to go and get it. Now, you can still take a knee if it trickles into the end zone, but there's a penalty for that in terms of how far the ball is advanced as a touchback. So there are 2 different types of touchbacks. I know it's a lot, right? So 2 different types of touchbacks. If the ball hits anywhere in the landing zone first and then trickles into the end zone, and then the player runs back, grabs it, takes a knee, whatever, it's a touchback, but it comes out to just the 20-yard line. And you're going to learn the significance of that as we talk about what Coach Izzo talked about in his presser, because there's some significance to that and something that he referenced, and now it makes a lot more sense when you think about the context of the rule. So if the ball lands in the landing zone initially and then trickles into the end zone, let's say the return man is set up at the 15-yard line, the ball goes over his head, it lands at the 3, and it trickles into the end zone, and it ends up being a touchback. The ball comes out to the 20-yard line, which is great. That's honestly what you want as a kickoff return unit, is for the ball to land somewhere in the landing zone, go into the end zone, and have it be a touchback. Now they got to go 80 yards for a touchdown on the drive. If the ball goes into the end zone in flight, it does not touch the landing zone at all until it hits the end zone, right? It doesn't hit the ground until it touches the end zone. And then it's a touchback. It comes out to the 30-yard line. So that's the new touchback rule, right? Then it comes out. So you're penalizing teams for kicking it straight into the end zone because they want this play to actually transpire. They want it to happen. Part of the reason they enacted this new rule is because the kickoff had become sort of ceremonial, right? All right, we got to kick it off, but it's going in the back of the end zone. It's a touchback. Team's going to start at the 25-yard line, and you minimize damage that can be done to you, right? Just give it to them at the 25 and let's just play football. Well, they're trying to avoid that. So to force teams to kick the ball off and have a return, they want it to land in the landing zone. If it lands in the landing zone and the returner doesn't return it and it goes in the end zone, well, then the returning team is penalized by it only coming out to the 20. That's the old touchback rule, where if you had a touchback, ball comes out to 20. So you want to kick it in the landing zone if you're the kickoff team. If you're the returning team and the ball lands in the landing zone, you want to return it because getting it at the 20 isn't good enough, right? So if the ball lands anywhere before the landing zone, it's a penalty and the ball goes all the way to the 40-yard line. It's almost akin to kicking it out of bounds. Remember, if you kick the ball out of bounds, the possession, which is a legal kick, right? Ball goes out to the 40-yard line. Well, let's just expand that rule and say that if it doesn't land in the landing zone first, or it doesn't touch somewhere, if it touches anywhere on the ground before the landing zone, so before the 20-yard line, it is a penalty and the ball comes out to the 40-yard line. So you're penalized for kicking the football. So again, no surprise onside kicks, no squib kicks. All of those are dead now. Because if you kick an onside kick, obviously the ball's going to land before it gets to the landing zone. Now, I'm pretty sure if you get into certain situations late in the game, they'll, remove the rule because you have to kick an onside kick. But during the course of the game, there are no surprise onside kicks because the ball has to hit the landing zone first, or else it's a penalty. So those are all of the kind of nuances of the new rule. I hope that all makes sense to you. So once again, the kicker kicks the ball off from the original spot, the 35-yard line. None of that has changed. What is changed is that he's not going to have 10 guys lined up where the ball is as he runs up and approaches to kick it. Those 10, defenders that are looking to run down on the coverage unit are all going to be lined up at the opposing team's 40-yard line, okay? Which is the kickoff start line, the 40-yard line. They'll be lined up there. They cannot move until the ball either hits the ground or is touched by one of the return men, okay? Meanwhile, the guys trying to block for the returner are going to be standing in what is called the setup zone. That's between the 30 and the 35-yard line. 9 players are allowed in the setup zone, okay? Of the 9, 7 of them have to have their feet on the 35-yard line. So it creates only 5 yards of distance between the coverage unit and the blockers, right? They want to minimize the amount of space because that's supposed to minimize the amount of impact, which then minimizes the amount of concussions. 2 of the 9 guys are allowed to be somewhere in that setup zone from the 30 to 35. So you can be at the 31, the 32, the 33, the 34, or the 30. But you can't be on the 35, or you can't be, past the 30. You have to be somewhere in that neighborhood, right? Then you got your 2 return men. They're lined up in the landing zone. That's from the goal line to the 20-yard line, which is where the ball needs to land to force a return. Only people that can move, only players that can move on the field once the ball is kicked are the 2 return men and the kickers until one of the 2 things has happened, as I mentioned. Ball hits the ground or it is touched by one of the returners. The kicker, once he kicks it, can move. The 2 return men can move to adjust to the football. No one else can move until the ball either hits the ground or it is touched by one of the return men. So, again, a lot of nuances. All of this is going to be brand new in the NFL. There's going to be a lot of, kind of figuring things out. We'll talk about that as we talk about what L to the Izzo had to say. But that's the general gist of what this rule is going to look like and how it's going to be enforced. We'll talk more about this as we get closer because we're going to see it in the preseason. And like Coach Izzo talked about, nobody really knows. There's going to be a lot of adjusting going on the fly with this thing. Eventually, teams are going to find ways to exploit it, how to take advantage of it. Like, none of that stuff has been figured out yet. It's trial and error. But eventually, teams are going to find ways to take advantage of it. Teams are going to find ways to manipulate this rule, which is what, teams always look to do, try to find an advantage. That's eventually going to happen. And after that takes place, the league is going to have to either adjust the rules to accommodate things that are being done, or teams are going to find those loopholes, find those ways to take advantage, and they're going to continue to do that until something's done about it, right? So with that said, Coach Izzo talked for about roughly 13 and a half minutes. I thought it was really good, dialogue, and it really got me to thinking about special teams this season in particular in a totally different light. I mean, again, I was aware that the rules had changed, but I didn't really think about how significant it truly is going to be. I've mentioned it in my mind. I know it's different, and I know it's going to impact the roster, and I've talked about that already, how, you really should dedicate one roster spot to a guy that can actually return the football. But I still didn't think about all the little things, the subtleties, and the different, decisions that go into this, and all of the endless possibilities that can arise from this new rule change. So with that said, let's talk about what Coach Izzo had to say. He started out by saying, look, I've been obsessing over this new kickoff rule. He said, it's been invigorating on one end because it's given me something else to have to worry about and think about and game plan for, other than just kind of the monotonous, all right, this is special teams, this is what we do, year in, year out, yada, yada, yada. But he said this year it's different because you have to expect the unexpected. We don't really know how this is going to go. And I'm thinking about all the different possibilities of things that can be done and how we can implement this and implement that, and what kind of players we can put on the field. And so he's like, my wife hates the new rule because this is all I'm thinking about. He's like, I'm obsessing about it. I'm taking this home and I'm thinking about ways, while I'm at the dinner table, while we're spending time together. In my mind, I'm thinking, he's really, really thinking about how to maximize, this rule, how to prevent it from hurting us, but how to exploit the rule and have it be advantageous from a return aspect for us as well. So he's talked about really obsessing over this new rule. He said it's a significant rule change, and when he said that, it kind of hit me. He was like literally, he said this is the biggest rule change the NFL has undergone in quite some time, and I got to thinking about it. Most of the significant rule changes to the NFL generally have to do with special teams. There aren't many things you can change within the flow of the game offensively or defensively other than, calling penalties and how you're going to legislate certain things and acts, common to the game or uncommon to the game, like helmet to helmet, sort of, those sort of things, right? But, a lot of the special teams rules have changed over the last, decade to 15 years or so, from, field goals, extra points, that sort of thing. But this is a major shift because this is really affecting a massive part of special teams. We've seen the return game, especially in the kickoff aspect, reduced to next to nothing. Again, once upon a time, if you had a dynamic kickoff return man like a Dante Hall or a Joshua Cribbs, that was a game changer. That set you apart from a lot of teams in the league, because if you had a guy that could take it the distance, it changed everything. And that's why a guy like Cordero Patterson has been almost invaluable here of late, because that's a game changer. Think about Devin Hester and just how significant he was to the Bears making it to the Super Bowl, back in 2005, right? Like, think about how dynamic he was, how teams would do everything in their power to try to avoid kicking him the ball from a punting standpoint and a kickoff standpoint. If you've got a guy like that, it could change everything. And this rule is going to potentially give guys an opportunity to return kicks that wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity. And maybe it'll make some more household names and create more opportunities for guys to make big plays. And again, special teams is a massive portion of the game. It's a third of the game, but it's been reduced and minimized in impact from a return standpoint over the years, because teams have just said it's not worth it to kick the ball and allow a guy to return it. It's better off to just let them start from the 25. You know where you're starting from. You set your defense there, and you go about your business that way, instead of running the risk of having something crazy happen, like a guy, break through that first wave, and now all he got to do is beat the kicker, puts a little move on him, and he's gone off to the races for a touchdown, or a 47-yard return. Now they're starting out near midfield. To avoid all of that, just kick it in the end zone, right? And that's what most teams were doing. So, with these kickers having bigger legs, and it's nothing now for guys to kick the ball out of the back of the end zone. That didn't used to be the case. Guys didn't have those booming legs that allowed them to kick the ball off. And then, what also made it easier was the NFL, the kickoff used to be at the 30-yard line. They moved it up to the 35, and that made it easier for kickers. That 5 yards is a massive difference. That's the difference between you kicking it out of bounds or it being 2 yards deep in the end zone, which is very returnable, or, you kicking it 4 yards deep into the end zone, where that's more of a touchback, or that ball landing at the goal line or at the 1 yard line. Like, there's a big difference between 5 yards. And, if I honestly just felt like if you wanted more kickoffs, just move the kickoff back to where it originally was, which was the 30-yard line. But you still would have the threat of concussions and all that stuff. So, that's why they're trying this new rule out, that the XFL experimented with, had some success with, and seeing if it translates to the NFL. But it is a significant rule change. And here's why it's significant. All the things he kind of listed and talked about kind of opened my mind to the endless possibilities that exist. He talked about changing personnel on special teams, and I never thought about any of this stuff. That's why I said this is a lot bigger of a deal than I think a lot of us made it out to be, because you don't think about this, but normally on a return unit, there are no offensive linemen, right? Because it's such a fast-moving play. You want guys that are athletically gifted enough to move, create the space that is necessary, run down the field. A guy might break off a big return, and now you need one more block. You can't have a 313-pound offensive lineman running 50 yards down the field to deliver that final block. you need a 240-pound linebacker to do that, right? You need a 212-pound safety to do that, or a corner, right, that will run down the field and be that final block to spring him for the touchdown. Now with this new rule, because there's less running, Coach Izzo was like, you may be able to put 2 or 3 tackles or 2 or 3 guards on the field, or 2 or 3 alternate, offensive linemen on the field, because they don't have to do all of that running now. There's 5 yards of space between them and the guys they have to block. And those guys are going to be running towards them, right? More likely than not. You can just stand there and kind of wait. And then when the guy runs to you, catch him, block him. And all he has to do, that return man has to do, is break that first wave of defenders. And now it's just essentially him and the kicker. That's it, right? So linemen now come into play. I didn't think about that. He also talked about starters, right? Traditionally on special teams, you don't have a lot of your starting personnel on the field. Why? Because there's a lot of running. You don't want a guy running 50, 60, 70 yards down the field, covering this kick, and then having to turn around and play defense. It's too much. Now, with the advent of this new rule, it's only 5 yards of distance, right? Maybe you run an additional 10 to 15 yards to make a tackle, but it's not that far. Now, obviously, if a kicker, kickoff breaks and that returner breaks through that first wave, you might have to go chase him down. But ultimately, the goal is to not have that happen. It's to make that tackle, 10, 15 yards away from, where you're running. And if that's the case, you can have starters on the field. So that's something else. I still think you're going to have core special teamers, and starters still aren't going to be on the field. But that's still something that is entered into the equation, right? You can maybe put guys that are a little bit more adept at getting to the football and getting guys on the ground on the field. A positional player as a kickoff specialist. So Coach Izzo talked about him experimenting with this in Houston back in 2016. He said, I might have been the first, special teams coordinator to do this. I'm not sure. But he's like, I put a linebacker as my kickoff, specialist. So he was kicking the football off when we were playing the Vikings. Again, I told you, when you have a dynamic return man, it causes you to start thinking about, alternatives and thinking outside the box, because this guy is so dynamic, he can change the game. This is now going to be entered back into the equation. If you've got a dynamic, this is why I think it's important that Washington find a return man. I don't think we're going to have that guy on the roster this year. Maybe Kaz Allen is that guy. Maybe there is a guy here that can be dynamic as a return man. But I think you have to dedicate a draft pick to a guy that was dynamic in college and allow him to do that at the NFL level. Like teams that have already done that, like the Chargers, when they went and got Davis, Demario Davis or Darius Davis, from TCU a couple of years ago. I wanted him in the draft for this specific reason. Not necessarily because I knew the rule was going to change, but just because I knew how dynamic he could be. He had like 5 or 6 kickoff return touchdowns in his career in college. That's the kind of guy you want in the NFL, because like Cordero Patterson, that dude will catch it 5 yards deep in the end zone and bring it out and still run it for a touchdown. Like, it doesn't matter if you're that dynamic. And so not many guys have the green light to do that. But he said back in 2016, when Cordero Patterson was at the peak of his superpowers, we had to figure out ways to try to get this guy on the ground. And so one of the ways that he tried to, invent in his mind was, I'm going to put an extra special teams player out there instead of a kicker who's essentially useless after he kicks the ball. I'm going to put a linebacker out there as the kickoff specialist, because this guy can kick it off. He can kick it deep. And if Patterson breaks that, first and second wave, I still got another guy back there that can actually make the tackle. Well, he's like, the first kickoff went well. The second one, the linebacker tore his quad, because that's not a natural motion for a linebacker. A lot of times guys do workouts that strengthen their body specifically for the movements that they have at their position group. Kickers aren't going to be doing a bunch of, box jumps and, squats and all kinds of things that you might see a receiver or a running back or offensive lineman do, they're going to be doing things that allow them to be, flexible and have that ability to be, have the ability to move. They're not looking to be tightly wound because they need to be able to kick the ball, have their leg raise up and not tear something, not strain a hamstring, right? So they're not looking to lift for power, which is, why it was always funny watching Joey slide because he was a meathead, but he used to play linebacker, so it makes sense. But anyway, I digress. He said the linebacker tore his quad, so he's like, that kind of changed the way he viewed putting, different positions, back as kickers if they could do it, because you don't want to get guys injured, but it is something to consider. Like the Chiefs, for instance, this is why it always comes up, because the Chiefs have a guy that can kick the ball off in, Justin Reed. He's already proven that he can kick it off and he can kick field goals. He kicked a field goal last year, and I think it was a long field goal too. I think it was for like 48 yards or something like that. But he can kick the ball off. He can kick field goals. And so if you got a guy like that, you could use him. He sort of turns into a weapon for you, especially if he's a safety and he's got that kind of, athleticism and ability to make tackles. The safety is literally the last line of defense on defense. So having a safety back there as the last line of defense on a kickoff would be very advantageous, but not most teams have a guy like Justin Reed. But, that's still something to consider. He talked about hitting the landing zone, the ball hitting the landing zone, and how impactful and important that is. And I've already kind of explained to you why it's important. That ball needs to consistently hit the landing zone. And he said, that's why you can't just put anybody back there to kick it off, because the consistency of that ball hitting the landing zone is going to really determine how effective your kickoff coverage unit is going to ultimately be. If you're, not consistently hitting the landing zone and that ball's going, 6 yards into the end zone, or it's going 2 yards into the end zone in flight, that they're coming out to the 30, right? That ball is advanced all the way out to the 30. So these are the things you think about. You don't gain a single yard on your possession, but the ball came out to the 30. You go 3 and out. You're punting with ample space, and your punter is going to have an opportunity to flip the field position. Think about how we, view where you're punting the football from. Like when you get trapped inside your own, 15-yard line, like let's say you catch the ball, you fair catch the ball at the 13. A lot of times as fans, we're like, just get one first down. Just get one first down, because a first down isn't always 10 yards. It might be 17 yards. You might get a first down and it might yield you 17 yards. And then if you have to punt after that, you're like, we got space now. You started at the 13, but you got a first down. It was 17 yards. Now you're at the 30, and now if you have to punt, you got plenty of space to punt, and the punter is going to have an opportunity to pin them inside their own 20-yard line, right? So think about that, how important it is to not just kick the ball deep into the end zone and have it be a touchback and have the other team start at their own 30-yard line, versus kicking it in the landing zone, and if it doesn't go in the end zone, they have to return it. They have to return the ball. There's no fair catches. You can't really run the risk. If that ball lands at the 16 as a return man, you can't run the risk of letting it trickle down. It might stop at the 4. Now you got to pick it up and do something with it. It's a live ball, right? So, in recent years, over the last 2 years or so, return men have gotten lazy. The ball would land at the 2, and they'd watch that thing land at the 2 and then just assume it's going to trickle into the end zone, and officials were giving them the benefit of the doubt. Like, if that ball doesn't go into the end zone, it shouldn't be a touchback. And there were times where the ball would land on the goal line, bounce back into the field to play, and that returner wouldn't even bother touching it, and the official would give him the benefit of the doubt. With this rule, that doesn't exist. You got to go get that football, right? You got to make it a touchback. But it may not go in the end zone. You have to field it. If that thing lands at the 16, you got to catch it and run with it. And he talked about dirty balls. Okay, pause. Okay, so he said, as a special teams player or coordinator, they have a term for, kicks that aren't, the standard traditional up in the air, allow a guy to get under the ball, behind it, get a running start, catch it on the move, and run. Dirty balls are the ones that, might be kicked on a dead line, right? Or it might not have that trajectory, or it might be a knuckleball, right? Or it might be one of those pop-up kicks that land a little bit shorter than normal. Your return man might be lined up at the 5, and this ball might draw him all the way up to the 18-yard line, and he's kind of in between. Should I catch it? Should I let it bounce? He's like, you're going to have different types of kicks. Like, we don't want return men having the opportunity to get behind the football at the 5. You get a running start, catch it on a dead sprint, and take off, because, again, the importance of that guy, stuttering or hesitating is important. It allows the kickoff coverage unit more time to travel and get closer to him. If he's able to catch that, because remember, they can't move until the ball either hits the ground or it's touched by one of the return men. If he catches that thing on a dead sprint and they still haven't even moved yet, and he's already running full speed, he hits a seam, he could be gone, right? And again, the only guy back there to stop him is the kicker. Who thinks the kicker is going to make a tackle? Like, the kicker, this is why you think about putting a positional player back there as your kicker on the kickoffs, because I know I watched one of the USFL games, I think, a clip from it, or I watched, where, a kicker that was really popular on YouTube named Destroyer, or Destroying, or whatever the hell his name is. A lot of people are like, yeah, you should sign him. Well, he goes out, tries to make a tackle, and he hurts his neck. Like, his career might be done, right? Like, you as a kicker, you're going to be involved on these kickoffs. If that guy breaks that first wave, you're the last line of defense. So you want to make it as hard on those return men as possible by kicking the ball, on a line drive, having it land in the landing zone, or kicking it, in different directions. That's why having 2 return men back there is so important, because if it's just one guy back there, you might try to directionally kick it, make him run at an angle to go get the ball, so he's not running towards, the field of play. He's running back towards the end zone, trying to field it. And if he catches it, but his momentum is taking him in the wrong direction, that's giving the return coverage unit an opportunity, more time to get closer to him to make a tackle. You see what I'm saying? So having 2 guys back there kind of helps alleviate that. But he talked about those dirty balls, right? Pause again. And how impactful those are going to be, kicking the ball all over the place, making it tough on these return men. But also, you have to be careful with those dirty balls, because if it doesn't land in the landing zone, if it lands at the 22-yard line, that's a penalty. Ball's going out to the 40. So you got to be careful with that as well. He talked about, the return aspect of this, and he said, look, a guy with a running back background would be awesome in these situations. Like, a Deebo Samuel is made for this type of thing, because having that kind of strength, that core strength to break tackles, run through arm tackles, like, literally, this is more like a running back play now. This is more like a running back getting the football than it ever has been. When it was a traditional kickoff, there were waves. Like, that first wave, there was another wave. You had to weave. You had to have agility, the ability to not have to stop to make cuts, string cuts together, that sort of thing. If you could hit it, without having to change directions at all, that's ideal. That's the best way to return a kickoff. But a lot of times you're going to have to weave in and out of traffic, make a guy miss. With a running back on a handoff, if you get a gaping hole and then there's just the safety and you make him miss, you're off to the races. That's kind of how this kickoff is, right? There's that first wave of defenders, and then you got that second wave, or really there's that one last line of defense, and if you can make him miss or outrun him or outrun his angle, you got a chance to score. So he was like, a guy with a running back skill set with that ability to run through arm tackles and contact, stay on your feet, have that contact balance, and still have the speed and the ability to hit the home run would be ideal. You know who I thought about, right? Who comes to mind when you think about that? Yeah, we might have been 1 year too late on Antonio Gibson's real true value. This feels like where Antonio Gibson would have been able to shine, right? I think I'm going to choke, or vomit in my mouth if I watch Antonio Gibson break a kickoff return for a touchdown in this new setup for the New England Patriots. That might have been one of the reasons that they sought after him, because remember, very few of our ex-players landed in a new system, in a new situation on the first day of free agency. He was the only one, right? We had a bunch of guys sign other places, like Logan Thomas just signed with the San Francisco 49ers. Good for him. Casey Toohill went to Buffalo. A number of guys ended up sprinkled around the league, but none of them, other than Antonio Gibson, ended up on a team on the first day of free agency. Like, they sought after him. They saw something in him, and maybe, just maybe, they saw his ability to maybe flourish on these kickoffs and said, we got to have this guy. I don't know. We'll see. But I don't know if the rule was even enacted at that point. But you could see the writing on the wall that it was going to happen. So he talked about it would be nice to have a running back, back there, which we don't have a guy back there that would, we don't have a guy at the running back position right now that I think would make a lot of sense back on kickoffs. I know they're probably experimenting with some of those guys, but none of those guys have that kind of speed, right? He said the most important job of the kicker, the place kicker, is to make kicks, which is 110% spot on. Like, we could talk about kicks landing in the landing zone, this, that, and the third, being able to kick dirty balls, all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, you have a chance to put points on the scoreboard. That trumps everything. That trumps everything, because you can kick the ball and it land before the landing zone, and that team starts at the 40-yard line, and then on the first play, they try to go play action fake, and you get a sack, and you destroy their whole drive, and they got a punt. So your kicker didn't do a great job, but the defense bailed them out, and now they're punting the football. Whereas we get in the field goal range, we need these 3 points. We make a touchdown, we need that extra point. Right? Like, you have a chance to directly affect the game by putting points on the scoreboard. That is the most important job of a kicker. I think all of us can agree on that. But, getting it into the landing zone is going to be pretty important as well this year. But nothing trumps making field goals, which is why Ramiz Ahmed is going to have an opportunity. Like, I don't want to discount this guy. He made all of his kicks during OTAs this week. And so he's going to have an opportunity. He's going to have the first crack at this job. As I mentioned, they're going to bring in competition. I fully expect them to scour, the waiver wire when the UFL season is over. Opportunities to go get a guy. I know a name that keeps popping up among fans is Jake Bates. If he's available, that's a guy that could potentially end up here competing. And so, again, they're gonna add some competition, I believe, as we head into training camp. But Ramiz Ahmed is gonna have a chance, and he's got a big leg. And something else that Coach Izzo brought up, and this is a great point. He said that touchbacks might end up being the best option. We don't know, because you may kick it in the landing zone the first 25 times, and 13 of those first 25 kicks may end up where the team is returning it on average to the 34-yard line. And you're like, yo, F this shit. We're not going to keep kicking the ball off, and guys are almost breaking this thing, taking it to the house, and they're getting it on average out to almost the 35-yard line. Hell, we're better off kicking it in the end zone for a touchback and having them bring it out to the 30, if that's the case, right? Or you give up 2 touchdowns in the first 4 weeks. On this kickoff, you're like, you know what? The coach might be like, nah, F that. Kick it in the end zone. Let's take the touchback. They start at the 30. We're not doing this, right? So he's like, you got to have a big leg, because ultimately we may decide that the touchback is the better option to go, right? Touchback might be the better option to go. So I I thought that was, something that I didn't really think about either, right? There's so many different layers to this. And then he talked about competition. He said they're in competition mode at return man, which we know that. They don't, he said, we're trying everything, which we know because they had Emmanuel Forbes back there. They're trying any and everything right now, which, like you said, like we've heard them say, this is the time of the year to do that, right? This is the time of the year where you try, things that you wouldn't normally try as you get closer to the season. You need to have some sort of decision made, as you get closer to the season. This is the time of the year where you can start to, try out everything, all the possibilities, lay them out in front of you. And then as you get to training camp, you start to narrow the focus. You don't have time to waste now. We got to get to the brass tacks of everything and figure out exactly how we're going to go about, handling the responsibilities of returning kicks. But he said they've got a bunch of different body types back there, a bunch of different type of athletes back there. So they're just trying to figure out, what's going to end up being the best situation. I can't stress this enough. I've brought this up. The back end of the receiver position is unsettled. There could be a roster spot dedicated to a guy that can just be a return man. And again, I keep bringing his name up because he may be the best of what we have currently on the roster, and we know he's capable. He did it in college. In terms of returning kickoffs, Cass Allen will have a shot if he can improve upon what he was a season ago. He was not ready to make an NFL roster last year. He couldn't catch the ball as a receiver. He didn't field punts well. That was his first time in his career really fielding punts. He did not do a good job. He muffed one in the final preseason game, which I think ultimately put the nail in the coffin for him and killed any opportunity of him making the team. But with this new rule, it opens up the potential for a guy like Cass Allen, who might not have had a real, niche carved out for him in the NFL because, kickoff returns were really obsolete. Now that is back in the fold, a guy like Cass Allen, who might not normally end up on an NFL roster, may all of a sudden have an opportunity. A guy like Damiere Byrd, someone else who has a kickoff return background, who might not have been on this football team, he may ultimately have a chance. He's a better receiver than Cass Allen, and if he can return kicks, that could open up a spot. Again, I think they're going to keep 6. I think that last receiver spot is going to be reserved for a return man. I think the first 5 guys are going to be guys that can contribute on offense and maybe special teams. So the first 3 guys in particular we already know are on the team. Terry, Jahan, and Luke are already on the roster. I think Diami, because of his ability to play special teams and contribute as a receiver, he's going to make this football team as your 4th receiver. I think the 5th receiver is going to be someone that they feel really good about in case of an emergency, in case there's an injury at the receiver position. This guy can step in and there's not going to be a massive drop-off. For some of you, that may be Jamison Crowder. For people like myself, I think it's going to be Olamide Zaccheaus. All right? Whatever the case may be, I think that's where that 5th receiver is going to, and that guy has to play special teams as well, right? I think that 6th spot, though, and it'd be great if the 5th guy that I just mentioned also doubles as a return man, which we know Crowder has done as a punt returner. I don't know how good he'll be as a kickoff return man, but we know Crowder has done it as a punt returner. I personally would like my kickoff and punt returner to be the same guy. I don't really want to have to divvy up those responsibilities, but if I have to, I will. But I would prefer it to be the same guy, right? So I'm not using up a bunch of roster spots to try to do multiple things when I can just have one guy do all of it. But you have to have a backup plan, because if that guy does go down and he's doing everything, now you're going to have multiple guys filling his spot. So you do want to have versatility there. You want to have guys that can do multiple things. But at the end of the day, I think that 5th receiver is going to be more of a wide receiver than he is a return man, but he can maybe do some of those return man things if need be. I think that 6th guy is going to be primarily a return man, and in a pinch, he can help you at receiver. So it'll be the opposite of what that 5th receiver is. That 5th receiver is more of a receiver, but in a pinch, he can help you on special teams. I think that 6th guy is going to be the reverse of that, right? The inverse of that. He's going to be more of a return man, but in a pinch can help you at receiver. So I think that opens up an opportunity for a guy like Kaz Allen, a guy like Demir Bird, right? We'll see, right? But all of these options are available, and a guy like Kaz Allen, if he wants to make this team, this is where he's going to have an opportunity to do it, right here, right? So we'll see what happens. Special teams is going to play a major role, and I wanted to talk about special teams, and hearing from Coach Izzo made it abundantly clear this is going to be a game changer. Even if it's only here for 1 year, this is on a trial basis. If it doesn't work out well, much like the offensive, the pass interference challenge rule, which was 1 year, it was one and done. This could be one and done. They could go in and say, you know what, this was a disaster. Teams found ways to take advantage of this, and it turned out to be a mess. Let's just go back to the traditional way of doing it. We might tweak a few things, but we can't have this rule be like this, moving forward. But ultimately, I think this rule is going to be here to stay. I think it's going to have the intended effect. There will be some unintended consequences, as always with anything that you do. There are going to be some unintended consequences, which is what Coach Izzo talked about. He's like, look, eventually teams are going to figure out ways to manipulate this thing. They're going to figure out ways to take advantage of this or that or this, and the league may have to clean up some of those loopholes, or that just may be one of the things that teams do, and you're going to have to figure out a way to stop it, to combat it, right? And he's like, that's the thing, is problems are going to arise, challenges are going to happen, and we got to be able to, on the fly, figure out how to, to deal with it. That's what makes this such a challenging situation. But he's like, I'm excited about it, but I'm also like obsessing over it. Special teams is going to be a big deal. Hopefully, we're on the right side of this thing, and we're taking advantage of it, and we're not one of the teams that's being taken advantage of with this new special teams rule. What do you think? Leave it down in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this, what Coach Izzo had to say, the new rules, how this roster may be impacted, who is the best guy to return kicks. They're still trying to figure that out. All of that stuff. Leave it down in the comment section. Can't wait to read your responses. But ultimately, that's going to do it for me, your man Louie T, here on this installment of the Command Post. You know what it is. Post up. Take command. Until next time, you guys have a good one. See you next time. Louie T.